This is a Quiet Loud Studios production, the podcast network where reflection meets amplification.
Hello, Athlete Mindset community. This is Lisa Bonta Sumii, the host of Athlete Mindset. Before we dive into this episode, I want to invite you to support the mission and purpose of our show. For $10 a month, you can help to make sure these conversations get to as many athletes, teams, coaches, and sport mental health environments as possible. As a subscriber, you will receive exclusive content and updates on current topics in athlete mental health, and you'll be directly contributing to the betterment of mental health for all athletes. Join the cause. Subscribe at sportse.io/athlete and make a difference today. Again, that's sportse.io/athlete. With your support and amplification, we can ensure more voices are heard and more individuals and communities are positively impacted. Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Athlete Mindset Podcast. So happy you all are here. And I'm even more happy that I have Courtney Messina here with us. I'm going to do her a big intro here, but I want her to say hi to everyone first. And then I will jump into all the incredible things she is and what she does for us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for welcoming me, Lisa. I'm really excited to be here today and talk with you, and really appreciate the ability to have this opportunity.
No, awesome. It's going to be great. Like we said, it's like us having like a little coffee talk, a little sort of like confidential, anonymous, potentially kind of talk about the athletes that we serve, but in a casual and down to earth and relatable way. For those who might not totally get all the lingo, we're going to break that down for them. But when I said what Courtney does for all of us, I'm meaning those of us in the field of mental health that serve athletes. So let me tell you a little bit about who she is. Courtney is a licensed professional counselor, supervisor, and a licensed chemical dependency counselor, and is the senior director for Outpatient Clinical Operations at All Points North, leveraging extensive experience in clinical leadership and behavioral health services. Not only does she do this incredible work at All Points North, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail, she is also a former Division I athlete at Ole Miss. Courtney, well, you have to say, your bio here doesn't say it, but you played soccer. We have to say that.
Yes.
Courtney.
Toddy.
Yeah, we all know why. Courtney is very passionate about working with the athlete population. Yes, you are. She's a visiting senior therapist for the athletics department at TCU, Texas Christian University, and is listed in the USOPC's mental health registry. I'm so excited. Yay. We've been planning this for a while. And so I'm excited and happy to dive right in. What do you think?
Yes, I'm very excited. Thank you, Lisa.
And thank you for all the work that you do. So we're going to get to know it a little bit more. In your clinical work, in the roles that you play, what do you see as the major areas that athletes come to therapy for?
So some of the main areas that I can think of would be things like sports injuries, mental performance issues, relationships, anxiety, and stressors back at home.
Awesome. Not awesome that happens, but it's awesome that that's a lot of what therapists and people in therapy can talk about, and athletes in this particular situation. Before I comment on that, tell us more about the athletes that are being served at All Points North, because I know there's a unique athletes, like specialized programming. Which stands APN aside and outside and like highlights them as an organization that prioritizes athletes. Can you tell us a little bit about the program?
I can. I really appreciate you saying that first and foremost. I really am a big believer in what All Points North does to serve its elite athletes that come through its doors. So All Points North, so we are a behavioral health provider. Our flagship location is in the Vail Valley in Colorado, specifically the city of Edwards. And we do, as you mentioned, have an elite athletes program. We refer to that facility in Vail as the Lodge. And typically, if athletes, whether they are still currently active in the league or are retired, if they are needing services for mental health, substance use, or trauma, we can accept them into our program and they will typically start their course of treatment out at the lodge at residential level of care. We do have a couple of detox facilities, one in Denver and one in Dallas Fort Worth, if that level of care is needed for them prior to residential. And I would say, give or take, our athletes will stay at the lodge for somewhere between 30 and 45 days. And when they are ready to step down, most of them will step down into our virtual intensive outpatient program where they
Mm-hmm.
can be there from anywhere between 8 to 12 weeks. I would say the larger percentage of the athletes that we serve do come from the NFL, and a lot of them are retired. So give or take 1.5 couple years post career, and they're really struggling, whether it's with mental health or that identity or transition piece back into their normal day to day. I really love how All Points North has dedicated clinicians within its overall team that are specifically there to serve our athletes that are under our care. And one of my missions, Lisa, as of late, is to really try to make an effort to expose All Points North Lodge to other sports because obviously you and I both know that the NFL isn't the only league out there that has athletes who are in need of care. So just a little bit about
Absolutely.
APN.
No, I love it. And I asked about it for lots of reasons, but I think that the main reason is to show that there are different levels of care that athletes, in this case, those who play or have played in the NFL, have different levels of need potentially. That, like, the residential, if folks don't know, is like you live there, you get treatment every day, you go to groups, you go to individual therapy, you have maybe family therapy. Like, there's a lot of things that go on. There might be some medication evaluation that goes on, right, in a residential situation, and so that's more high needs. And so for those guys who are coming out struggling with, and this is a big, big topic. I mean, I think it will continue to be athlete identity, that transition out of the league and who am I now? What's my purpose? What do I stand for? Can cause some acute mental health manifestations like depression, extreme anxiety, even feeling suicidal or having acted on suicidal thoughts is an important thing to say. That doesn't mean that everybody, right, who struggles with athlete identity or transitions out of their sport needs that level of care. But what would you see presenting from that athlete who is a human being who might need that care at that level first?
So you touched on a couple of those elements. I would say that if I had to truly make a guess, I obviously don't have the numbers right in front of me, but
Yeah, of course.
I would guess that the larger percentage of the athletes that are in our care right now and between residential level of care and our virtual IOP, we have 20 plus players in treatment with us
Mhm,
at the
mhm,
current
mhm.
time. And I would say the larger percentage of that group is struggling more so with the mental health piece than they are with the substance use piece.
Mhm.
A lot of
Interesting.
our athletes, and some of them really don't even have any history of substance use. It's just the mental health piece surrounding, like you said, whether it's that transition out of sport where they are, when you look at it from a clinical perspective, it's like they're almost grieving a loss when
For
you think
sure.
about it,
Mhm.
because really, regardless of whether it's at the professional level or the collegiate level, so much of their anxiety is tied up into their sport. And whether it's, something like injuries or retirement and things of that nature, those things can really lead to what I would consider to be an identity crisis.
Yeah.
And that can result in struggles with mental health, whether it's anxiety or depression. And sometimes, as you mentioned, it can be severe enough to where they start experiencing, suicidal ideation and things that are more severe.
Yes, yes, and that's real, and yes, it does happen to athletes, and yes, it happens to men, and yes, it happens across racial and ethnic, a continuum of identities there, and so, like, you and we've talked about this, like, mental health challenges do not discriminate
Mhm.
by by any, like,
Yeah.
identity or category you might say you belong or identify with, and so I think it's so important that we normalize that and
Mhm.
be more open about it, and that this is a natural course of how things can feel and go for a person, and that if someone is depressed, even diagnosed with depression, there can be a level even within the diagnosis that's actually mild, more moderate, and severe, and it can kind of move up and down that continuum while still in one level of care, which I think is
Mhm.
really important to note. But the things you said earlier around sports injuries, mental health, relationships, anxiety, things like that, they can still show up in the residential situation, just more acute. But you, as an outpatient therapist and working with collegiate athletes too, how, like you were mentioning the loss, like it's loss of identity, but in sports injuries, it's also the loss of identity, but in a different
Mhm.
way, right?
Mhm.
Can you speak a little bit about some of your experiences working with athletes around sports injuries when it comes to them coming to therapy with you?
For sure. So obviously, the injury is going to take a toll on them mentally, right? Whether it's at the collegiate or professional level. So these elite athletes, they can't practice, they can't play. They will oftentimes, depending on the injury and its severity, they'll have to go lighter, in the
Mhm.
gym when it comes to workouts. And so there's this fear oftentimes of, I'm going to be falling behind and not continuing to progress forward. And when it comes to injury, I think the other piece to also recognize is that elite athletes are hesitant and just will flat out not report an injury
Mhm.
sometimes so they can finish out the season, or so they can avoid being put on an injury protocol and not be benched. And there's that mentality of, let me just, quote unquote, push through it, right?
Mhm.
Finish
Mhm.
out the season. But you and I know that there's always that chance, if that athlete pushes through it, they can ultimately, oftentimes put themselves at risk for a more serious injury if they
Mhm.
don't get it taken care of. And so when they're not practicing, they're not playing, there's that component of feeling isolated from the team, not as engaged in what's going on. loneliness even can creep in. I've talked to collegiate athletes about how to deal sort of with that loneliness. And to speak specifically to the identity piece you asked about, it's those thoughts that the athletes will often experience that, well, now that I'm not playing, it's like, well, who am I
Mhm.
outside of being an athlete? What am I supposed to do with my free time? Obviously, outside of whatever rehab they're needing to do for their injury and things of that nature. And so I think from an injury perspective, when they're no longer playing or they're not playing at least for a temporary stint of time, it's that questioning that kind of naturally comes up in their mind about, well, who am I? Or like I said, what am I what am I supposed to do when I'm not on the court or on the field?
Right. Right. Exactly. And I've found, and I'm wondering if you see this too, it's like, how do I even eat differently or better for my body? Because I'm not training right now. I'm not at that level anymore. I'm transitioning out. How do I eat? How do I move my body? Do I still have to work out like that? Or how do I even change it? I've always been doing this. And so like just your relationship with your body and how do you reconcile that, so to speak, and not feel like you are quote unquote like being lazy or cheating or something. Like I
Mhm.
think I've heard that a lot. Have you?
I have, in the sense that I can think of some football players that I've had the privilege of working with that unfortunately have had more than one injury that they've had to deal with. You know, that's always to me so
Right.
devastating. You
Right.
are talking to a player that has an injury to whatever extent, they start to recover, and then something else happens
Mm-hmm.
to another part of their body, and it's completely devastating to them, just
Mm-hmm.
completely devastating. But in terms of the relationship with food, I mentioned the football players specifically because I have seen that very quickly when they are not engaging and participating in that rigorous routine that they're used to day in
Mm-hmm.
and day out, they will pretty quickly start to notice changes in their whether it's their muscle tone or muscle composition, their overall body fat and things of that nature. And it's, I think men and women oftentimes think very differently about their appearance and their body image, but even these, what I would call tough, football players can start to become a bit self-conscious about what they look like when they're not training. And I think it, especially for those who maybe have not sustained an injury that's going to require them to be out of pocket for a decent stint of time, I think it kind of, at least my perception is that it can kind of sneak up and surprise them sometimes on how quickly they can become a bit self-conscious about their bodies. And I think it ultimately, whether they want to admit it or not, it can bother them.
For sure, for sure. And I agree that it's different for men and women, and we could have a whole nother podcast recording episode with us about
Yeah.
that, about body image, disordered eating potentially, things like
Yes.
that, and like self-perception. But I think it's so important that you're saying men and these guys who you don't think would ever worry about that do because they're changing. It's that loss of that sort of athletic build or some, however they want to word it, but like that, oh gosh, it's changing. And is it okay for now? Is it okay if I'm leaving the sport for good? Like it's just it's another part of the transition.
Yes.
It's part of another and recovery if you're coming back, that type of thing. We've talked a lot about what areas athletes might come to residential, intensive outpatient, or outpatient therapy. What are some of the ways, strategies, tips, kind of approaches that you use in maybe any one of these or two of these when you work with your athletes?
Gosh, I can probably think of a number of things that I really
Okay.
try to
Yeah.
hone in on with this population. But
Mhm.
one thing that quickly comes to mind is that identity piece that you and I have already mentioned a couple times today. I try to encourage the athletes that I work with to, even though it's can be really hard, but to ultimately remember that their sport is not at the end of the day who they are. It's something that they do. All the
Mhm.
while knowing that it's very easy for me to sit across from them and say that. It's a very different thing to really accept that piece of it, I think, for them in their minds. But I try to remind them, you're a father, you're a sister, you're an athlete, you're a sibling, you're many more things than just an athlete. The second thing, believe it or not, that I can think of that I find myself talking about all the time with athletes is get enough sleep.
Mm.
I talk to them so much about getting enough sleep, meaning they have rigorous schedules that they are following on a daily, weekly basis, whether it's the pros or, a D1 student athlete in college. And it's interesting that, some of them will describe to me, some will talk about, hey, what time do you go to bed? What time do you wake up? And it's interesting sometimes to realize that they're really probably not getting the sleep that they need to perform at their maximum potential. And I try to just, preface to them that getting enough sleep is going to help them in so many ways, right? It's going to help them focus better. It's ultimately going to help them experience an overall better mood, regulate their emotions, feel
Mhm.
stronger mentally, perform better, and, you know, have a bigger bandwidth, I would say, for frustration, right?
Mhm.
So those are two things that I can think of right off the top of my head. I One thing I will share, again, having the privilege to have been a college athlete, I've always been close with my father. He's been such a supporter of mine in my sports career and in my life. But he had read this somewhere and he had shared it with me during my time in college, and I have now tried to pass that along to some of my collegiate athletes that I get the privilege of seeing. And that is this concept of, despite the immense pressures of being an athlete, to enjoy your time. I tell them to enjoy your time in college because it's the longest vacation of your life. And so you might as well, enjoy it, despite the demands and the pressures that you're under. And that would really kind of lead me to my next thought, just in terms of a support network. I
Mhm.
really strongly encourage them to build a strong support network. And that can mean whether it's including professional help, say, whether it's therapists or doctors or dietitians or nutritionists, whatever resources they have available to them. And then in combination with personal support too, whether that's family or friends or, clergy or whomever, they consider to be a part of their support system. And then I would say the last thing would just be to really build what I would classify as mental resilience. And what I mean by that is the athletes, as we know, whether it's at the collegiate or professional level, they have some very big expectations and demands on them. And I think a lot of them struggle with that concept of I have to be perfect all the time. I have to perform at a high level all the time. There's no room for mistakes, right? I got to be perfect. And so I really try to kind of help them dial that mindset back and think more along the lines of focusing on progress rather than perfection, but then also at the same time, understanding the importance of coming up with coping tools or coping strategies to deal with setbacks and to deal with losses because as an athlete, you're always going to have those.
Mhm.
They're inevitable. So,
Thank you. That's a very rich and robust list. I think every time when you mentioned each one, I was like picturing one of the athletes I work with in my mind, like, oh, yeah, that's what we've talked about, or that's what we've kind of addressed. But I want to go a little deeper because what if there is a collegiate athlete out there or a pro who's like, okay, those all sound great, but what does it actually mean that I'm more than an athlete? What is enough sleep? You know, what do you mean by enjoying my time? Like, I think a lot of I have found want like real concrete like ideas about it. So like I actually in the last few months I had with one of my collegiate softball players, she was like, "You hear more than an athlete all the time. There's like even a hashtag for it on Instagram and blah de blah." But like I think I finally figured out what it means. And I'm like, "Oh, talk to me about it."
mhm,
And it's because a lot of them feel like I am an athlete and that's all I am, and I'm proud of that. Like, I don't wanna be anything else, right? Like, that's my identity. Why would I wanna be more than that or not just my sport? It is my sport, and, like, that's how I get to express myself, and that's how I get to, like, get validation and feel good about myself. So, it's a tricky one I have found sometimes, and, like, I'm sure, as you know, it's unique to each athlete, but, like, what that means, and it's not minimizing your athlete identity or not minimizing how important it is. I don't want us to, to feel like we're devaluing them or like
mm,
not really celebrating who they are in their sporting environment and in their team and their contributions they make. I just don't think that they've ever really thought about what it means to be anything else. And I think those kinds of conversations, because you and I know that like if you are only an athlete, then there's a risk that you will be that your self-esteem and self-image and perception is dictated by the wins and the losses and the X's and the O's, right?
mm.
It's out of your control how you feel about yourself based on the scoreboard, right? If you were to explain, and like kind of get really nuts and bolts, black and white, about how you would explain it, what would that sound like?
So I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, athletes that are transitioning out of sport per se and experiencing these struggles with the identity piece, it's going to, in a way, be a bit unique case to case. I think
Mhm,
depending on their support circle or perhaps their current relationships or their
mhm,
family dynamics, but you really honed in on you said a word and I was going to respond by saying self-esteem is something that I work with a lot on with the athletes
mhm,
that I see, and it is something that, interestingly enough, comes up in quite a few conversations, especially with the transitioning out of sport piece, because as we said, their identity, I mean, understandably so. I mean, I can even think back to when I was a college athlete at
mhm,
Miss.
mhm,
I
mhm,
walked around not with a
mhm.
chip on my shoulder, but I walked around campus like sporting my Ole Miss athletic
Yeah, with pride.
pride.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, with
yeah,
pride, or
totally.
a professor like, "Oh yeah, that student is an athlete." Like, heck yes.
Mhm,
Like
mhm,
that was a big thing. But the self-esteem thing comes up as well because it's and it's a struggle sometimes, like you were mentioning, it's a struggle to empower them to realize that there are other things about themselves that they'll eventually realize that they appreciate about themselves, or that
Mm-hmm.
they'll learn that other people in their lives appreciate about themselves, but because they have been so centralized in their sport world for so long, it's not, like you said, it's really not even going to be a blip on their radar. Kind of like what you were saying, well, who cares what somebody in my family thinks about me, right? It it only matters what social media, says about me or thinks about me. And I'll never forget, I had this one athlete that I was actually working with on this identity piece, and this was an athlete who really had some high expectations of himself, wanted to go pro, wanted to qualify for the Olympics and things of that nature. And,
Mm-hmm.
part of our time spent together was talking about, hey, like these are all great aspirations. You're young, go for it. You only live once. But at the same time, what's plan B, right? And a lot of the times they don't want to talk about what plan B is, right? If I were to get injured, what am I going to do from a collegiate perspective? If, I wake up tomorrow, get injured, and I can't play anymore, is this truly the campus, right, that I want to be on? And we were working through some identity issues, and I had him do an activity with me where he had to identify other parts of himself and
Mm-hmm.
other than being an athlete. And he was able to do it. And then as I had him essentially describe those other parts of himself and get him to eventually share about what he liked about those other parts to himself, my goal was to really just show him that, again, that whole concept of you're not just an athlete, right? There's so many other important parts to you. And I'll never I'll never forget, because I'm definitely a clinician that likes to get feedback from my clients, because if we're not going in the direction that they want to go, I'm not a mind reader and I want to know. So I want to know
Mm-hmm.
how to pivot. And
I
so
mean, just like any relationship, right? We want to check in
yeah,
and know and kind of see.
communication.
Yeah,
Yes. And
totally.
so and so if we do a specific activity like that, that's really like pinpointing a certain topic, towards the end of the session, when we're done with that activity, I'll ask my client, like, again, you're not going to hurt my feelings. Was this helpful? Was it not? If it was, what was helpful about it? What did you kind of learn about yourself? And he looked at me after he was able to identify, maybe 4 or 5 other parts, important parts to himself. And I said to him, I said, so, did you find this helpful? And he just looked at me and said, nope, I sure didn't. And it makes me chuckle. And I share that with you because, again, it is a very serious part of the transition piece, but I also share that too because it is hard. It is really,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
difficult to get them, I think, they can recognize those other parts of themselves, but for them to actually sit across you and say, I believe in those other parts of myself, and that's enough to be just those things without the athlete piece. That, for me, with my experience, that's the harder piece for them to actually believe that.
Yeah.
So,
To believe, believe. No, it's a great, great story and brings it to life for so many of us, right? Listening, and for me, for sure, and my work, that the belief, but also the value of those other parts.
mhm,
I'm sure, I mean, I've seen that they don't value being a sister or a brother as much as playing at this particular level, whether it's collegiately or professionally and all that
mhm.
comes with it. They don't value it just yet. But I think we could do another whole episode on just like brain development and kind of where these young people are at in their own, human psychological development and their ability to see beyond the moment and be so instantly gratified by the things that are close to you, the shiny thing maybe, or the easier thing to kind of see yourself doing or being about. But, I think we should, and I think it'd be good that I think every parent, coach, teammate, player needs to know where they are at in their own development to see what's realistic and how to communicate and how to talk to yourself and each other. It's like so complex in that area for sure. Ah, these young people that we, like you say, have the privilege to make relationships with and to have these important conversations with is like super just, it gets me up every day.
Mhm.
It's just cool.
Yeah. And they need that. They need that person to be a sounding board. They need that person to push them to not tell they don't need that person to tell them what to do because that's not our job as
No,
therapists.
no,
Very, very much so the opposite
that's
of
right.
our role is. But, I often tell them when I first meet athletes, I tell them just that and I follow it up with that hopefully during our time together I can maybe allow you to think about some things from a different perspective.
For sure.
So,
Yeah. That's the gift that can come, a collaborative gift that can come from the alliance, the trust, the leaning in. And
mhm.
so it's just really, really cool.
And there's always something you said earlier, it made me think there's always so much more going on with that athlete than what it says on the intake paperwork. That is,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
when you
Exactly.
asked me,
Exactly.
when you asked me earlier about, what kind of common themes do I see, for athletes that are seeking therapy or seeking counseling.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
I rattled off anxiety. I'm thinking to myself, I see anxiety so much on intake paperwork, but when you actually get in front of the athlete, there there's just so much more. There's always so much more going on than just anxiety. It's not just anxiety. There's gosh, suicidal ideations or, self-harming behaviors. There's disordered eating, body image issues. So it's always interesting to me when I get referrals to read what's on the intake paperwork, but in my head I'm thinking most likely it's not just that and it usually is the case.
Totally. And it's what you come to therapy for isn't always the thing you actually work on in therapy,
True.
right? And that even if they put anxiety down, there could be a whole gamut of how that manifests for that individual person and
Yes.
where it manifests and how it manifests, all the way from panic disorder and having panic attacks to like I get a little nervous before a game or at
Mhm.
sitting at an exam. Like there's
Mhm.
such a continuum. And I think that's so important to continue to emphasize the continuum of how something can manifest and how unique it is to a person based on all those things, family, relationships,
Mhm.
religion, culture, ethnicity, country of origin, all the things that all have an impact on how you view what mental health even is. And
Yes.
so I think it's so complex and I get so curious. I'm like, okay, you put anxiety down as a like, let's dive in. What does that actually
Mhm.
look like and mean to
Mhm.
you? And da, da, da. It's like you get to like it's like putting a puzzle together. I'm like, okay,
Yep.
which piece are we gonna put here? Like, oh, you want to go over there and do that one? I have to do this one. And it's just, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. My last question, maybe not my last question. I'm not gonna lie. The one that I have that I plan to ask you, but let's see where it goes
Mhm.
is what would you like our society to know about what athletes at the pro and collegiate level go through when it comes to their mental health? You and or your colleagues at TCU or APN, what do you guys talk about? What do you collaborate on or consult with one another? But when it comes to this piece, what would you like our society to know? What would you say?
So many things, Lisa.
I
So
know.
so many things. Like you
Yes.
said, we could do a whole episode on just this piece, but I was recently at a conference several weeks ago in Denver that was centering on elite athletes and mental health and well-being. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I definitely would want to express in terms of this particular question is that on a collegiate level, I think that people either don't know or forget sometimes that suicide is the second leading cause of death for NCAA student athletes
Mm,
behind cardiac arrest.
mm.
And, I think that is, a perfect segue into, my other thought is that, I think society with this specific population has to understand that athletes are often scared to ask for help because there is that stigma associated with having mental health issues.
Mhm.
And there is that fear that as an elite athlete, I am going to be judged, or there is that fear of, in their minds, potential ramifications, right, on how this is going to affect their quote unquote status on their team.
Yep.
And well, if I come forward and endorse, struggles with mental health, people are going to look at me in a different way and people might view me as weak. And so I think society has to understand, and especially those that are directly involved in the sports world, whether it's trainers or coaches or any ancillary support staff, that just as much as physical health is prioritized, the mental health piece has to be equally prioritized because let's face it, whether it's the pros or the colleges, like these coaches want to win and these coaches are expected to win.
Mhm.
And my perspective on it is if these coaches can have happier and healthier athletes who are taking care of their mental health, the athletes are going to be giving themselves a better chance to perform well and give themselves a better chance to adapt and handle challenges better, which at the end of the day, in my eyes, is all aligned with the goal to win. Um,
Yeah. Yep.
and that's, because winning, that's part of the nature of the beast. And, I think we touched on it a few minutes ago, but we mentioned social media. I mean,
Mhm.
our day and age where it's just nonstop, constant things on social media, the society has to understand that athletes at the elite level, their pressure to perform, it's always there. It's constant.
Yep.
And with social media in the picture all the time, athletes can face a lot of public scrutiny because, again, that concept of I have to perform flawlessly all the time. And God forbid I have one bad game, or God forbid I have one bad performance or make a single mistake, that can lead to criticism or a loss of opportunity. And it gives people an excuse to post something, online with social media. Athletes, I've read articles and have heard stories about athletes feeling like they're experiencing some form of online harassment
Mhm.
because of the constant social media. And I just think that these elite athletes, it just can be completely overwhelming and exhausting for them to, maintain this quote unquote flawless, flawless image.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I know I
And that
threw a lot at you, but
No, I mean,
I
it's just,
said we could have a whole hour on this specific piece. So
well, on each of the areas, and there's more, I'm sure, on your list, but it's in the end, I think mental health is health.
Mhm.
We as therapists are healthcare providers. You know, one is mental health and physical health are dependent on one another for the full human being to be healthy, amongst other kinds of health that we want: financial health, you know, social health, fiscal health, whatever. I think that it's so easy to separate them, and there's so much more stigma on what could go on in the head and the brain. You're gonna shrink my brain, you're gonna shrink me up, you're gonna, like, do this, do that. I think that when we talked earlier about the physical injury and pushing through, it become more severe potentially if you push, quote unquote, "push through." It's the same with mental health injury or mental injury. We can be depressed or have a stressor that causes to feel depressed, and whatever that looks like for that human being. And then you push through, it's no big deal. I'm good. Like, I can figure it out. I'm going to push through. I don't need to talk to anybody about it or get checked out like you would with your trainer if you had something going on that wasn't feeling like yourself.
Mhm.
We push through, we push through. We don't want to seek help because it's more stigmatized and you feel like there's going to be more, just like on the physical side, the athlete doesn't want to tell their coaches or trainers exactly what's going on because they're going to lose minutes. Same on the mental health side. They're not going to talk about what's going on for them, stress wise, burnout wise. I had a tough conversation with my boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. I'm going to try to, like, leave it, but how do you leave the whole human being off the field or the court or wherever it is? And so then it's heightened, and then you're comparing on social media who you are. And then it can get to unchecked, unlooked at, to feeling one of the most extreme manifestations of depression on that more acute side: suicidal ideas, ideation, thoughts, ideas on how you can not be on this earth anymore, and things like that. It's so treatable, though.
Mhm.
Depression and anxiety, two things we've talked about over and over today, the number one and two most frequently diagnosed mental health conditions, and they are the most easily treated. This thing called suicide is treatable,
Mhm.
and it's a form of depression. People need to know that. Athletes need to know that, coaches, parents. So, all of us working together in this society to have these conversations, to be able to not just normalize and destigmatize, but act on these things and not be afraid to have a conversation that could be embarrassing or nerve-wracking or shameful, but, like, literally, and I'm not trying to be dramatic, you could save a life with that.
I was just gonna say, but life-saving
Because
from from a simple conversation.
I was just gonna say, it can be that easy.
Mhm.
It can be that easy in this very complex state of mind when someone is feeling like they don't want to live anymore,
Mhm.
right? I'll share one story at the end. Like 3 years ago, I was at Association for Applied Sports Psychology conference, one of the annual ones that we have that I attend. And they had a panel with the mental health sort of team that supported the San Francisco Giants at the time. And at the time, Drew Robinson was on this panel. He's a suicide survivor, former MLBer, and now a mental health advocate. And he talked about, and this was 3 years ago, he was like, about 10 or 12 years ago, going into the athletic training room was something that the guys didn't want to do. They thought it was weak. They thought, like, I should be able to work through any of my own, physical ailments. I've been working on this and know my body all along. I know what to do. I'm not going to go have someone work on me, like, and figure me out. They're like, no way. I'm not going to be seen going in there. He said that, and then he said, there will be a time when there is a mental performance, mental health, mental resilience room where players can go in there just like you would an athletic training situation and go there and get, quote unquote, taped up or worked on or work on something from a mental standpoint that's going to be just as occurring as an athletic training room and an athletic trainer on every team. Wouldn't that be just fantastic? We're getting there. We're getting there. I believe Drew when he says, like, hey, it used to be like that. And now look, this is what's happening in this field. And I think it's going to be more and more accepted, more and more valued. There's going to be more and more money put behind it. We haven't even talked about that. But like the value, putting your money where your mouth is about putting this kind of service and support into schools, into leagues, into clubs is just gonna rise more and more. And it starts with conversations like this, bringing awareness and like saying, "Oh, I want to help. How can I help? How can I help my local team, my youth team, my school, my league, whatever?" Is so important. So, I mean, yeah, we've like put each other in the zone here talking about this. And
That's
I
that's really
appreciate you, and your time. And if there's any last closing remarks you'd like to share with us, the mic is yours. I can't appreciate you enough as a person, as a human, as a colleague, and doing this work alongside you, knowing that you're doing it too, like brings me a lot of gratitude and comfort. And just, I really appreciate just the woman, the person, the human being that you are.
Thank you, Lisa. Likewise. And I think, to sum everything up and leave it more on a positive note, I do agree with you from that powerful story you just shared that I think we have really come a long way in working towards destigmatizing mental health struggles for the athlete population. I really do wholeheartedly believe that. I think that we have taken a lot of measures and actions in terms of getting the appropriate people more training so they are more
Uh-huh.
knowledgeable on mental health struggles and whether that's what somebody can truly go through, different forms that symptoms can present themselves, right, depending on the diagnosis. And like you said, even to the extreme points of no longer wanting to be on earth. And so, but yeah, I think one of the key words that you hit on was action, right? Because you can train and train and train and provide info all day long, right? Till we're blue in the face. But if we're not, like you said, putting the money where our mouth is, then, how are we really going to expect to see legitimate change? And so, but I do think that we've come a long way. And I think that, the future looks it's looking hopeful. It's looking hopeful because what I've found, remaining close to this population, whether it's myself or folks like you, there's a lot of other folks out there like us that are just as passionate about this population, who wants the best for this population, and who wants to provide those additional layers of support that are so needed and are so deserved, for how they give back to the community too, as athletes. So we didn't even discuss like everything that they do for us. So
Right. Definitely part two, part three, part four down the
Mhm.
road for sure. So many things we can talk about. See, how was this coffee chat? This is what we talked about over coffee.
Yep. Exactly. Definitely a coffee chat. Yes. So
For sure.
always like to end on a positive note. So
I appreciate you. And again, thank you so much for everything.
thank you so much, Lisa. It was a pleasure being on with you.
This podcast exists because of the team at CAS-CM. CAS-CM is a B2B content production company helping organizations create and share their stories. We aim to create space where businesses can build assets and drive revenue through writing and talking. Content creation should be enjoyable and accessible. At CAS-CM, we love helping make that happen. Learn more at cascm.com.